Okay, uh, this is our lecture on slavery in the North American colonies, which is also our lecture 4, corresponds to chapter 4 in your textbook, Out of Many, A History of the American People. Um, Hold on, I went too far, clearly. Back up. There we go. Um, as modern 21st century Americans, we've come to regard slavery as a thing of the past, something that is distinctly foreign and other when compared to our own experiences and our own frame of reference. This is in spite of the fact that there is a long and deep historical connection between the United States and the institution of slavery. Um, we are now a century and a half removed from the time when slavery was still legal in the United States. And for that reason, it is difficult for us to imagine a society in which slavery was not only present, but was actually one of the cornerstones upon which the whole social system was constructed. Um, it is so foreign to us that perhaps it is necessary to start with the definition of the word slavery. And for the purposes of this class, the definition of slavery is the following. It is a social institution which treats individual human beings or classes of human beings as property, subject to the control and use of their masters. Or, if you wanted me to put it in a more simple and direct formula, slavery means human beings equal property. That's the basic essence of slavery. It converts human beings into property. As we proceed with this lecture on slavery in North America, there are 4 things I want you to keep in mind concerning slavery in general. First, slavery is not unique to the United States or even the Western Hemisphere. There have been many slave societies in human history. Indeed, prior to the 19th century abolitionist movement, which effectively ended legal slavery, as opposed to illicit slavery, like the sex trade that continues to flourish today in large parts of the world. In most parts of the world where Western European peoples held power, slavery existed in nearly every society in some form or another. And indeed, most human societies at some point in their development or another have had the institution of slavery. Slavery is not unique to the Western Hemisphere or to the United States, not at all. However, number 2, in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, following the beginning of European settlement here, a different form of slavery arose. And this type of slavery linked the idea of slavery, which as we have seen is fairly universal, with the idea of race, and particularly the idea that a racial hierarchy exists in which some races are fit for domination and mastery, while others are fit to be subjects, to be slaves, to be servants of the dominant race. Third, it is important to remember that slavery and race are separate and distinct historical phenomena. You can have a multiracial system of slavery in which people of many skin colors and ethnicities are enslaved. One example of this would be the ancient Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire, both of which enslaved peoples from all different races, nationalities, cultures, language groups, etc. This, by the way, is why I've put this movie poster up there. As you can see, this is a movie poster from the 1960s film Spartacus, starring Kirk Douglas. One of the things I really like about this film is that it was an excellent depiction of the institution of slavery as it functioned in the ancient Roman world. The Romans enslaved people from all over the known world. Spartacus happened to be a Thracian slave who was purchased from Thrace, which is part of it's near Greece, and He was made into a gladiator, so he fought death matches with other gladiators for the amusement of his owners and the crowd. And he led a slave revolt against the Roman Republic at this time. This was right before Julius Caesar um, established the Roman Empire. And one of the great things about the film is that it illustrated the diversity of slavery in the Roman period, the Greek and Roman period. So certainly you can have a system of slavery which is not linked to race, a system of slavery in which people of all different nationalities and backgrounds are enslaved. And likewise, you can certainly have a system of racial oppression which does not involve slavery. For example, following the Jewish diaspora in the 1st century AD, Jewish people have been subjected to severe oppression in many parts of the world, including Western Europe. They were banished from Spain in the 15th century. They were banished from Britain in the 13th century. Of course, in Eastern Europe, they were subjected to the Holocaust by Hitler's Nazi Germany in the 1940s. They were subjected to anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia in the early 1900s. So you can certainly have a system of racial oppression that does not involve slavery. The Jews were persecuted all over the world and have been for centuries, but they've very rarely been turned into slaves. Likewise, the system of apartheid in South Africa did not involve slavery, but certainly it was a system of racial discrimination and oppression, or Jim Crow in the South, another example of this. However, in the New World, and particularly in the English colonies in North America, slavery and race definitely were linked to one another. Indeed, in the colonies, they were linked from the very beginning of slavery there. Fourth, whatever else it might be, slavery is first and foremost a labor system. In a slave society, the master owns the body of his slave, but that is not an end in itself. The master also owns the labor of his slave, or his ability to produce goods and services which might be of use to the master. And so the master has the right to extract as much material benefit, as much profit as he possibly can from his slave. This is the purpose of slavery, to own another person's labor and to derive an income and wealth from that labor. All right. So, those are the things I want you to remember about slavery in general. Now we can turn our attention to slavery in colonial North America. But before we talk about slavery in North America, we ought to discuss how slaves got there in the first place. And they got there by means of an extraordinary and also a terrible historical process called the Atlantic slave trade. It's important to remember that slavery existed in Africa for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Columbus sailed to the New World. For generations, rival tribes in Africa had waged war with one another, had taken captives from each other, many of whom were then forced into slavery, which became part of the booty, part of the profits of war. The continent of Africa, moreover, had been supplying slaves for people in other lands for centuries before European nations began colonizing the Americas. The first to take slaves from Africa, as far as we know, were probably the Romans, who enslaved people, as I said before, from many different nations. Next, Arab Muslims from North Africa and the Middle East began to bring slaves overland from sub-Saharan Africa and trade them in slave markets throughout Europe and the Middle East. In the late Middle Ages, some Spanish and Portuguese slave traders even brought a few African slaves to Europe. But for the most part, there was little European interest in African slaves, in acquiring African slaves, until colonization of the Americas. But colonization in the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, it changed all of that. The conquest and colonization of the New World did two things. One, it put vast new expanses of territory under the control of European nations, Spain first and Spain's competitors later. Two, it created a huge demand for labor that the European colonizers needed to fill if they were going to settle the land and to exploit the economic opportunities that the land held. Now, at first, European colonizers tried to fill the need for labor with Indian laborers, either as outright slaves or as forced laborers. The Spanish, for example, had something called the encomienda system, where Native American villages were forced to come up with a labor draft, a certain quota of workers who would work for the Spanish masters for a certain term of months during the course of the year. Um, so at first they tried to fill the need for labor with Indian laborers. As we've talked about in previous lectures, however, the huge epidemics that usually followed in the wake of Europeans making contact with Native American peoples decimated the Indian populations wherever the Europeans went. In central Mexico, for example, up to 80 to 90% of the native population died off from disease within a few decades of the European arrival. Indian slaves would also often run away. They knew the terrain better than the Europeans did, and other Indians would help them run away. So for all of these reasons, Indian slaves didn't make they didn't make for a long-term solution to the European colonizers' labor needs. And so over time, the European colonists realized that Indian slavery wasn't going to work, and so they turned to African slavery instead. Now, this transition did not happen all at once, uh, nor did it happen at the same time everywhere. The Spanish were the first to begin importing African slaves. The first shipment of African slaves to the New World that we know of occurred in 1510 when King Ferdinand authorized a shipment of Africans to Santo Domingo. Not long after that, Spanish colonists were using black slaves to mine for gold and silver in their mines in Mexico and South America. English colonies in North America didn't start importing slaves until the 1620s, after the tobacco boom in the Chesapeake created a need for labor there. So different European colonial powers get in on the slavery game at different times. Once the demand for labor had been created, and once the feasibility of importing African slaves to the New World had been established, it was really only a matter of time before the slave trade really began to take off. And over a period of roughly 3 centuries, from the early 1500s to the early 1800s, the trade went through what I would describe as 3 major periods in its history. One would be the Portuguese period, followed by the Dutch period, followed by the English period. The Atlantic slave trade started in earnest in the mid-1500s, and the first nation to really capitalize on the trade was Portugal. The Portuguese had colonies in the New World, particularly in Brazil. But most of their slaves went to Spanish customers either through smuggling or through what was called the asiento system. The asiento system involved the Spanish government giving a license to a particular person or a company, a group of merchants, to import a product, in this case slaves, to the Spanish colonies. The Spanish usually only gave asientos to Spanish citizens or Spanish merchants, but in this case they made an exception. Because the Portuguese were in a position to supply them with a large quantity of cheap African slaves. The Portuguese established the basic methods that would be used by slave traders for roughly 3 centuries of this trade. Slavers set up outposts called factories on the West African coastline. You see a picture here on this slide of a slave factory located on the Gulf of Guinea. The factories were basically forts. They were large fortifications that had large slave pens inside of them. You see in this, you see there's uh, walls surrounding it, and inside here there are places for keeping large quantities of people, large numbers of people. Um, and they would be the slaves would be kept in these pens until they were ready to be loaded onto ships and transported across um, the Atlantic. Now there is a popular stereotype out there. Um, you can see it in the motion picture series Roots, which came out in the 1980s, to the effect that slave traders would go into the jungle from time to time, and they would capture slaves themselves. They'd kidnap slaves, throw nets around them, or put chains on them and drag them back to their ships that were waiting at the coastline, and spirit them away to the Americas. In point of fact, that rarely ever happened. For the most part, the European slave traders stayed very close to the coastline. They didn't go into the interior at all, in large part because they were susceptible to various tropical diseases that were prevalent in West Africa at that time, and it was very dangerous for them to do that. Rather, they typically bought slaves from local African middlemen, paying them in trade goods, usually metal, guns, tools, cloth, etc. And there was an endemic tradition of intertribal warfare in Western Africa that kept producing a steady stream of war captives who could then be sold to European slave traders. In some ways, the slave trade encouraged um, the, the habit of West African nations going to war with one another to acquire new captives. After the Portuguese, in the 1630s, the Dutch West Indies Company made an aggressive push to take over the Atlantic slave trade. They swept along the West African coastline, seizing Portuguese strongholds and factories. And by 1640, the Dutch had essentially taken over all of the Portuguese outposts along the West African coastline. As with the Portuguese slavers before them, most of the Dutch slaves went to the Spanish colonies. At first, they had to smuggle the slaves in, which was relatively easy due to lax Spanish enforcement um, of its trade policies. In the 1660s, the Spanish government recognized the reality of the situation, and they started granting asientos to the West India Company, which would continue to dominate the Atlantic slave trade until the end of the 17th century, until the end of the 1600s. In the early 1700s, English slave traders, like the Dutch before them, took over the slave trade in a huge way. Um, the English slavers would continue to dominate the slave trade until Parliament banned the trade in 1807. So they controlled the transatlantic slave trade for about a century. English control of the slave trade brought two significant changes to it. One was dramatically increased volume. Under English control, the volume of the slave trade expanded exponentially. At their height, the Dutch slavers for the West India Company only brought over around 2,000 to 3,000 slaves per year. By the 1760s, under English control, around 80,000 slaves were being transported per year, more than half of them on English ships. Um, the other significant change that occurred during the English period of the slave trade was that they started making regular trips and transporting regular shipments of slaves to the English colonies in North America. Most of their slaves, of course, still went to the Spanish colonies in Latin America and to the Portuguese colony in Brazil, but they did start transporting a regular number every year to the English colonies in North America as well. Um, Before we move on from the slave trade, I want to talk about some basic facts that you need to be aware of regarding the slave trade. First concerns the numbers of people involved. Nobody knows the exact number of slaves taken from Africa over the 3 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. The best scholarly estimates that we have put the figures at around 10 to 12 million. A few estimates go lower than that. A few estimates range as high as 20 million. But the best estimates that we have are somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 million people. That's over the 3 centuries of the slave trade. So certainly it is a massive historical phenomenon, a massive demographic phenomenon. I think you could easily say, truthfully, that it is the largest forced migration in human history. Uh, the second fact that I want you to be aware of concerns the distribution of of the slaves, where they were sent to. Um, of these 10 to 12 million slaves, less than 5% went to North America. The remainder, more than 95%, went to Latin America and to the Caribbean. Nearly 4/10, about 38%, went to Brazil, which had a huge demand for labor there. And roughly the same number, about 39%, went to various parts of the Caribbean, and the rest went to other parts of Latin America, to Central and South America. A major difference, though, between um, the outcomes for the slaves who went to different parts of the Western Hemisphere is that in North America, the population of slaves grew much faster than in other parts of the New World. Today, uh, people of African origin in the United States comprise about 30% of the total black population of the Western Hemisphere. And a major reason for this was the harsher climate and working conditions that slaves endured in Latin America and in the Caribbean, where they were often put to work either in mining, digging out gold or silver ore from deep down in the earth. This is before the advent of modern mining technology with hydraulic lifts and power tools and so on. So it was physically debilitating, hard, back-breaking labor. Or they were often employed in raising sugar, which similarly is very hard, very very difficult, physically demanding labor in hot, humid climate, in conditions which are ripe for spreading disease and so on. And so in Latin America and the Caribbean, the mortality rates for slaves were simply horrific. It's not like it was a picnic in North America, certainly it wasn't, but it was far worse in some parts of the world than in others. And that brings me to the third point, um, and that is the mortality rates, particularly the mortality rates of the slaves on the slave ships. Obviously, the living conditions on the slave ships were absolutely horrendous. You can see here a diagram of the decks of an English slave ship around 1814. You had hundreds of people jammed into tight, cramped spaces, often stacked one right next to another, like silverware, or spoons was the metaphor that was often used. Um, these ships had very poor sanitation, no medicine was available for the slaves. They were very poorly fed, um, and the journey across the Atlantic usually lasted in the neighborhood of 2 months. So just imagine living in these conditions for 60 days or more. Obviously, disease is going to spread. Uh, Obviously, your there's always the possibility of violent death if you get out of line. Um, the the crew might punish you by killing you and so on. Um, and so this all of this led to very high mortality rates for both the slaves and also for the white crew members. Now, mortality rates did lessen over time. The slavers obviously wanted to get more of their cargo to the New World alive, or obviously it would, their their slaves would be worthless if they died. So they eventually learned to do things a little bit better, and death rates among slaves crossing the Atlantic went from around 20% at the start of the slave trade to around 10% by the late 1700s. But obviously, we're still talking about an incredibly dangerous and incredibly difficult and ugly um, process, which no human being in their right mind would want to experience. Interestingly enough, um, the mortality rate of white crew members actually did not improve over time. It stayed at around 20% throughout the entire period of the slave trade. And the most likely reason for this is that the crew members were on a boat longer. They were both there on the voyage to Africa as well as the voyage back, and so and also they were more susceptible to African diseases carried by the people in their holds. So if you were a white crew member on one of these slave ships, um, certainly you were not a slave, but there were substantial risks involved in you pursuing that occupation. All right. The first shipment of slaves to North America uh, ended up in the Chesapeake region. The first shipment of slaves to North America came on a Dutch ship that landed at Jamestown in 1619 and sold a cargo of 19 Africans there. We don't really know if they were slaves, however, because at that time slavery was not a common practice in the English colonies. Most likely they were held as indentured servants rather than as slaves, as were most blacks brought to the brought to the Chesapeake region over the next few decades. At first, the dominant labor system in the Chesapeake was indentured servitude rather than slavery. Most indentured servants were poor whites brought from England who came voluntarily for the economic opportunities offered in the New World. Um, in Indentured servants usually serve for a term of years, typically around 5 to 7 years. They were given free passage to the New World, and many of them came with the promise that at the end of their term of indentures, if they survived, um, that they would receive an allotment of free land, which they could then work on their own and become independent landowning farmers. The distinction between white indentured servants and slaves wasn't always clear. A servant's term of service could often be extended for even petty offenses. If you stole from your master, or if you got into a quarrel with your master, your term of service could be extended by local courts. And also, in the early years of Virginia, um, mortality rates for servants and slaves were very high. So most indentured servants probably died before finishing their term of service, which obviously would eliminate the main distinction between a servant and a slave, which would be that at some point the indentured servant would be free. Um, Up until the 1660s, African and white indentured servants interacted with one another a lot. They lived in the same quarters. They worked together. They ate together. They often had common law marriages which obviously would involve sexual relations with one another, which early on produced a mixed race population in Virginia. Um, by 1650, about 500 Africans were living in Virginia. Roughly two-thirds of them were slaves, and the rest were servants. At the same time, about 10,000 white indentured servants lived there. So obviously, the labor force is still predominantly white and indentured servant rather than African slave. In the 1660s, the black slave population in the Chesapeake region expanded dramatically. Um, as a result, slavery in Virginia and Maryland became institutionalized in the sense that it became part of the fabric of everyday life. You could say that the Chesapeake during this period was going from being a society with slaves to a slave society, meaning one in which slavery was a foundational institution. Um, in practice, this meant that everything in society was based on slavery: the laws, the culture, the social hierarchy, and so on. Let's talk about the new laws. The transition to a slave society can first be seen in a number of new laws regulating slavery and the black population in Virginia and Maryland. You see new miscegenation laws forbidding white and black sexual relations. Uh, People in interracial marriages were forced to leave the colony. You also see a new law passed in Virginia around this time that said that if a slave was freed, the owner had to pay his or her way out of Virginia. Um, Free blacks had virtually all of their rights rescinded. They could not vote, they could not testify in court against a white person, and so on. Killing one slave was legally defined as not murder because it was presumed that nobody would purposefully destroy their own property. And most importantly, the new laws made slavery a lifelong condition. Even as the legal code dealing with slavery grew in size and complexity, a massive importation of slaves followed from the mid 1600s onward, especially once England became involved in the slave trade. In 1660, slaves comprised approximately 7% of Virginia's population. By 1720, they accounted for 30%, and they continued to grow thereafter. So we're talking about a substantial shift in the balance of population in the direction of black slavery. So, why is this? Why is this taking place? Why is why are the English colonists in Virginia shifting from a labor force of mostly white indentured servants to a labor force of predominantly black slaves? Part of the reason for this transition um, was a change in attitude toward indentured servants that came about after Bacon's rebellion of 1675 through 1676. Let me tell you a little bit about this event. Uh, the leader of the rebellion was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. Um, at this time, in the 1670s, there were a lot of landless former indentured servants. Many of them had come to Virginia on the promise, largely because of the promise of being able to acquire land for themselves after their terms of service had expired. But Virginia at this time was running out of available land for many of these people to take up. So many of them had trouble securing land for themselves once they were freed. Of course, what do you do if you don't have enough land? Well, you've got to go find it. You've got to go get more land from somebody, somewhere. Um, the trouble really began when fighting broke out in 1675 between white settlers in the Virginia backcountry, the frontier region of Virginia, and local Indian tribes who resented white intrusion into their traditional territory. Bacon, who was at that time a member of the Virginia Governor William Berkeley's um, council, he asked the governor for permission to lead a force of militia troops against the Indians to punish them by taking their land. Berkeley said no, because he had forbade settlers from moving into the back country in the first place, and because he didn't want a war with the Indians. But eventually Bacon put enough pressure on Berkeley that he relented, and Bacon led his army into the back country and started slaughtering Indians left and right. Berkeley ordered him to show some restraint. Bacon ignored the governor. He even raided an Indian tribe that was allied with Virginia. And finally, Governor Berkeley had enough, and he ordered Bacon's arrest and imprisonment. And instead of turning himself in, Bacon turned his army against the government. Now, he had strong support from his troops. Many of them were former indentured servants, mostly white, but some black, who hadn't received the land that they had been promised once their service was ended. Bacon's rebels want to succeed in this war against the Indians, largely because this is the only way that they see a likelihood of them being able to acquire more land for themselves. Bacon's rebels actually succeeded in ousting Governor Berkeley from office, occupying Jamestown, but shortly thereafter, Bacon got sick and died, and this deprived the rebellion of his vital leadership, and the men became disorganized and unfocused. And the upshot of all of this is that eventually Berkeley came back into Virginia, led a large army from England to reestablish the government's control in the colonies, and Bacon's rebellion was put down. The result of all of this, the result of Bacon's rebellion, was that it scared Virginia's colonial government and wealthy elite half to death. Keep in mind, Bacon had led a biracial army of poor whites and poor blacks in an attempt to destroy the political status quo. This scared many government officials and wealthy landowners in Virginia half to death. It caused many of them to even begin rethinking the whole notion of indentured servitude, because they began to realize that relying upon indentured servants could lead to more rebellions. And thereafter, the number of indentured servants in Virginia declined rapidly. So, with the supply of indentured servants on the decline, what would replace them? And the answer was African slaves, of course. The demand for labor hadn't gone down. Tobacco cultivation still required lots of labor. And so, since the first solution, indentured servitude, failed, from the 1660s, 1670s onward, England began relying increasingly, the English colonists in Virginia, that is, began relying increasingly upon African slaves. Another factor contributing to the transition to slavery was the long-term decline in the mortality rate for all classes of people. In the early years of Virginia's settlement, the climate, the hard labor, and disease killed people off very quickly. Landowners didn't want to risk money on a long-term investment like a slave if they thought that their slave would die very soon. So it was just as effective, indeed often more cost-effective, to bring over a white indentured servant. As mortality rates declined, though, slavery seemed like a better bet, because if you own a slave and he lives for 10 or 15 years, you can extract labor from him for that whole period. Whereas the white indentured servant, you really only have his labor for about 5 to 7 years or so. The last factor that contributed to slavery's expansion was racism. Um, Even before they had encountered African peoples, Europeans already had a color coded way of thinking. The color black had very negative connotations because it represented sin and evil in European literature and religion. After Europeans made contact with African groups, they began concocting elaborate theories about a supposed racial hierarchy that existed in the world, usually with white Europeans on top and blacks on the bottom. So Europeans found it very easy to assign Africans to a subordinate position because of this color-coded way of thinking, and also because of their religious beliefs. For the most part, the African peoples that they encountered in West Africa were not Christians, and generations of religious warfare in Europe had taught Europeans to despise and mistrust all heretics, heathens, and especially non-Christians. All right, so that concludes slavery in the Chesapeake. Let's go on to talk about slavery in the Lower South. All right. Slavery in the Lower South, which we're going to define as the Carolinas and Georgia, developed according to a different pattern than in the Chesapeake. As mentioned in an earlier lecture, North and South Carolina were originally one colony until 1712, when they were divided into North and South Carolina. The southern half of the colony of Carolina developed a lot faster economically than the northern half. Moreover, the southern part of Carolina developed with slavery from the start. Many of the first English colonists there were planters from Barbados and other English Caribbean colonies. So when they came, they brought their slaves with them. So from the beginning, slaves comprised about 30 to 40% of the population in southern Carolina. Because there were plenty of slaves, Carolina had relatively few white indentured servants. There was little interaction, therefore, between white and black laborers. The workforce was segregated from the beginning, which is another thing that was different or separated the slavery in the Carolinas from the Chesapeake. Very quickly, rice became the major cash crop in the region surrounding Charleston in southern Carolina. It turned out that many Africans had cultivated rice in parts of West Africa. Rice was a major crop. Many planters only, pardon me. Sorry about that. If you heard the phone ringing, I had to answer my cell phone real quick. So rice had been a major crop in large parts of West Africa. You see this map showing the areas of West African rice production. So planters liked to buy slaves. Planters in Carolina liked to buy slaves from the parts of West Africa where rice was already grown, because they assumed that the slaves from those areas would come over with knowledge about how to grow rice successfully. Rice cultivation was hard work, hard, rigorous work. Move back up to this slide. It was very hard, very rigorous, very difficult work in wet, swampy conditions. Malaria and yellow fever were very common in areas where rice was grown. In Africa, many slaves had already developed immunities to these diseases, which made them even more desirable to their masters in the Carolinas. And as a result, the slave population in southern Carolina expanded rapidly. It started out with around a third of their population being slaves, By 1750, South Carolina actually had a majority black population, and it remained that way until the Civil War. Um, Slaves in South Carolina worked differently from slaves in Virginia. Whereas slaves in Virginia cultivated tobacco by working in groups, what was called the gang system, where you would have gangs of 20 or so slaves go out into the fields and work together. Um, Rice cultivation, rice growing, was done mainly by the task system, where slaves were assigned a number of tasks for each day or each week. And once they were done, they had the rest of their time to themselves. This is not as nice as it sounds, because usually they had plenty of tasks to go around that kept them busy most of the work day. Um, as previously mentioned, Georgia was founded as a philanthropic colony with the goal of resettling England's poor and debtors there. One of the rules the colony's trustees, including James Oglethorpe, imposed on the colony at the beginning of its existence was a prohibition on slavery, which lasted until about 1750. After that point, however, um, this ban on slavery was rescinded, and Georgia very quickly embraced slavery. Georgia settlers brought in many slaves from Virginia. Some of them acquired large landholdings, um, and in the coastal areas of Georgia, they grew rice in much the same way as the planters in southern Carolina did. The upshot of all of this was that Georgia very quickly became a slave society, um, very much in the same way as the Carolinas had been. Okay, um, this lecture wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about slavery outside of the South. So far, our discussion has been focused mainly on slavery in the South, both in the Chesapeake and in the lower southern colonies, or the Carolinas and Georgia. And with good reason. Far more slaves ended up in the South than anywhere else. It's important to remember, however, that during the colonial period, all 13 colonies had slaves. Slavery was by no means unique to the South or absent in the North. Slavery existed in colonial New England, but to a much smaller degree than in the Chesapeake or in the lower South. The Puritans in New England started buying slaves in small numbers not long after arriving in North America. Some of these were African born, and some came from the Caribbean. The Massachusetts Bay Colony actually had legal statutes regulating the treatment of slaves before Virginia did. However, New England never had to rely on slaves as a primary source of labor. Agriculture in New England was based mainly on small family farms, so slaves weren't really a vital labor resource. They weren't as necessary. Um, Most slaves brought to New England worked as house servants, or they worked on small farms with their masters. They were assistants or assistant laborers. There weren't any big plantations in New England with hundreds or dozens of slaves. Um, and so overall, the slave population in New England remained very, very small. Less than 2% of New England's population was slaves going into the Revolutionary War. In the Middle Colonies, likewise, they also had slaves, but the slave population there, again, never really took off to the same extent as it did in the Chesapeake or in the Lower South. By the time of the Revolutionary War, slaves accounted for about 10% of the population in the Middle Colonies. Most of them in New York were about 20% of New York's population, particularly New York City's population, were slaves. So slaves were more numerous in the Middle Colonies than in New England, but they were still fewer, far fewer in number than in the South. Likewise, in New England, slaves, um, or rather like New England, slaves in the Middle Colonies weren't really vital to the economic life of the colonies. Um, Many of them served as house servants or assistants to tradesmen. If you were a carpenter or a blacksmith or something of that nature, you would often purchase a slave to assist you in your work. Some slaves were hired out by their masters as laborers or craftsmen. Um, Other slaves were allowed to work essentially as independent workers, but they handed over a part of their income to their masters. This would be particularly the case if you were a slave who had some type of skill, like if you were a carpenter or a stonemason or something like that. If you had been trained in a trade, oftentimes what would happen in the Middle Colonies is your master would let you run your own business, so to speak. It wouldn't be your business; it would belong to the master. But you would work as a tradesman, and you would hand over a portion of your wages to your master. But otherwise, you'd be doing your own thing. Um, so owning slaves could be profitable. For many masters, though, owning a slave was more of a status symbol than anything else. It proved that you were rich enough and important enough to have a slave. It wasn't necessarily vital to your livelihood or your well-being. So let's talk then about the life and the culture of slaves in English North America. Now, as I mentioned above when I was talking about the slave trade, um, only a very small percentage of slaves brought out of Africa went to North America. Roughly 430,000 of the 10 to 12 million who were brought over, or about 4 to 5%. By contrast, the lion's share of the slaves went to Latin America or to the Caribbean. But something happened in North America that was different from the other places. Slaves in North America reproduced. By 1860, the United States would have around 4 million slaves. That's at the start of the Civil War. And that's having started out with a population of 430,000 brought out of Africa. So the slaves in North America naturally reproduced. Now, why is this significant? It's significant because it didn't happen elsewhere. For example, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, there were around 860,000 slaves. That's about twice what was imported into all of English North America. There's around 860,000 slaves imported to the French colony of Saint-Domingue from 1681 to 1791, the beginning of the slave rebellion there. Um, However, in 1791, the slave population of Saint-Domingue was only 480,000, less than half a million. So what happened? Obviously, the slaves in Saint-Domingue were not reproducing enough. There were not enough live births to replace all of their dead. So why this difference? Well, there's three main reasons. One, the climate. North America has a better climate. It's not as tropical as Latin America and the Caribbean. And as a result, the region was healthier with fewer diseases. Another reason was the sex ratios. There were more female slaves sold into North America than into the Caribbean or Latin America. In the Caribbean and Latin America, the gender distribution was overwhelmingly male. Of course, if you're operating a large sugar plantation where you know that your slaves are going to be forced to endure extremely hard labor, bringing over female slaves doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Um, and so the planters in the Caribbean and Latin America would encourage, would bring over primarily, or they would purchase primarily men. Um, North North America, by contrast, had more balanced sex ratios, and this allowed for families to form, and it encouraged more natural increase among the slave population. Also, the outlook of owners differed. This would be the third factor. The outlook of owners differed in North America. In North America, the slaves themselves were considered valuable commodities. They were labor, they were assets, and they were wealth. They were a form of wealth. In the Caribbean or Latin America, by contrast, slaves were viewed as a means to wealth, but they were not valued in and of themselves so much. North American planters thought that slaves would work harder if they were healthy and if they had families. Caribbean planters, by contrast, pretty much worked them until they died, and then they bought more. Um, of course, the slaves in colonial North America did more than just survive. They also struggled mightily to create a distinctive slave culture in their new home. The obstacles to doing so were many. Unless they happened to work in the same place as someone from their own tribe or language group, African slaves usually had trouble associating and communicating with other slaves. The colonial slave population in North America had come from different parts of Africa, different tribes, different language groups. But they all had one thing in common, and that was color. They were all black, and the master was still white, which became the basis of a shared culture. And the emergence of a distinct slave culture can be seen in the following ways. One is language. To have a culture, you need communication. Almost all slaves eventually learned how to speak English, but often with various African words and African grammatical and speech patterns thrown in. The result is you see the development of various pidgin languages in different parts of the South, combining one or more African dialects with English. An example of this would be Gullah, which is spoken on the South Carolina coast, and also Geechee, which is spoken on the Georgia coast. For example, if I was speaking to you in Gullah, and I said, tell him say the dog for bite him, I'd be saying, I told him that the dog would bite him. Or, we blan catch nef kuta de. I'd be telling you, we always catch a lot of turtles there. The key point here is that these pidgin languages, these distinctive slave dialects, formed a basis of communication amongst the slaves themselves, which also was separate and distinct from the language spoken by their masters. Yeah, there was some English thrown in, but there were enough distinctive African elements that the slaves could converse with one another without being generally understood by their masters. So that gave them a level of privacy that would not have been possible otherwise in their day-to-day communications and conversations. In terms of material culture, slaves in North America tried to preserve aspects of their African heritage through their material culture, i.e., the things they made, the things they wore, the things they used on a day-to-day basis. They tried to preserve these parts of their culture while also struggling to adapt to a new environment. For example, the pottery that they made. Scholars who've looked at pottery that slaves have made have found designs that closely resembled pottery used in West Africa. Oftentimes, the pottery of slaves would be decorated with symbols that were very common in Africa, like, for example, the Bakongo cosmogram, which is an X inside of a circle. This is a religious symbol that was often carved into the bottom of ceramic bowls that the slaves used for cooking and for eating. You see an example of a Bokongo cosmogram here in a bowl found at an archaeological dig in South Carolina. Um, Archaeologists who've looked at early slave quarters in South Carolina say that the slaves often lived in two-room houses with clay or wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs similar to those found in West Africa. So the dwelling places that they lived in resembled dwellings that they would have been accustomed to living in back in the home country in Africa. Um, Evidence suggests that many African cooking and eating habits also persisted for much of the colonial period. These included the eating of a starchy main dish, usually consisting mostly of boiled rice or corn, and secondary dishes or relishes consisting of spiced vegetables or meat, which would be ladled on top of the rice or the corn. Also, the using of a large communal dish or bowl, often called a calabash, from which food was served into smaller ceramic bowls, from which the people would then eat with their fingers. Or sometimes they would make spoons, large spoons from a gourd shell. You can see here an example of gourd. Let me go back up. Of gourd spoons that were used in the slave quarters in large parts of the South. They would often put their food in there and eat from that. And typically, meals were taken together in family or extended family units, and for the most part, people sat on the floor to eat. This was both because they typically didn't have tables or chairs, but also because it was common West African practice to eat while sitting on the floor. By trying to create a separate and distinct culture, slaves in Africa were also subtly and perhaps subconsciously asserting their independence from their masters. But slaves also resisted their masters in other more obvious ways as well. In general, slave resistance to white authority could be said to fit into one of three broad categories. The first would be passive resistance. This was the least confrontational form of resistance and therefore the one that carried the least risk. Passive resistance could include such things as pretending to be sick or pretending not to understand instructions, deliberately slowing down the pace of work, breaking tools, forgetting to do tasks or pretending to forget to do tasks, and so on. All of these are tactics designed to limit the amount of labor that the master could extract from you. Then there's active resistance. Active resistance is probably the most common kind of active resistance was simply running away. If you're reading Solomon Northup right now, you know that you may have reached the part where Solomon Northup runs away from Tibets in order to avoid being killed. This was a common thing that happened on southern plantations and farms. If a slave didn't like the treatment that he was receiving, or if he felt threatened by his master, he would often escape, and not necessarily escape to run away permanently, but run away into the woods or run away into nearby swamps or some place where he could steal away and be alone for a while before eventually being recaptured or returning. Other forms of active resistance could include killing the master's animals, vandalism, arson, or even poisoning the master. The risk involved in active resistance was linked to the level of injury that it caused the master or his property. The third form of resistance, and also the least common, was outright open revolt or resistance to white authority. This form of resistance carried with it the highest risk because it involves direct confrontation with the master, with the master class, the white people in your society. And it almost always carried the penalty of death. This kind of resistance could be carried out by an individual, a slave who just gets fed up with his master and decides to fight him or kill him, or by a group of people. And if it's a group of people, then it's called a slave revolt. Now, from the beginning of slavery in North America, slaves showed a willingness to revolt. Slaves on slave ships occasionally revolted, sometimes taking over the ship, but usually failing to do so. Once in the North American colonies, however, incidents of slave revolts were relatively rare. In fact, only a handful of slave revolts in North America are actually documented. The most significant of these was probably the Stono Rebellion of 1739. You see here an artist's depiction of the Stono Rebellion. It occurred near the Stone River in South Carolina. A group of around 20 slaves gathered together at a certain location and began marching down a common road or thoroughfare carrying a banner that read "Liberty," encouraging other slaves to come and join them. They ransacked a nearby store, killed the owners, stole a bunch of guns and powder and shot, and then went to nearby plantations and farms, killing slave owners. And once they got other slaves from the surrounding area, possibly as many as 100 to join in, they ended up killing overall about 20 white people. Eventually, a local white militia group caught up with these slaves, and a battle ensued in which about 40 or 50 of the slaves were killed. The rest of them were hung, they were decapitated, and their heads were placed on fence poles located about every mile along the road to Charleston, South Carolina, as a warning to other slaves not to repeat their actions. And after this, South Carolina's government put additional restrictions on slavery, including new laws requiring masters to carry guns, and rewards offered to slaves who turned in other slaves who were guilty of plotting a rebellion. The significance of the Stono Rebellion, aside from its obvious significance to the history of slavery in South Carolina, is that it illustrated the incredible risks that open rebellion or open resistance to white authority carried. If you were a slave, and if you chose to revolt against your master, you were basically taking your life into your own hands. Whether you're doing it individually or as part of a collective rebellion, you're basically accepting that you're going to die. You're most likely going to be put to death as a result of your action. And for this reason, slave revolts outright slave revolts or rebellions in English North America were relatively rare, because the slaves understood better than anybody the risks associated with taking this step, and they were very, very reluctant, very, very hesitant to sacrifice everything in the quest to overthrow their master's authority and to seek freedom for themselves. Not that they didn't want to. Many of them certainly did, but they understood just what terrible risks they were running if they actually did so.